Guys, welcome back to XRP Insider Network, where we connect the dots between global macro moves and what it means for your XRP before the mainstream catches on. Let's get into it. If you clicked on this video expecting a simple legislative update, you're going to get that. But what most people covering this story are completely missing is the second order implication, the one that explains why the smart money is paying very close attention right now and why the retail crowd is still asleep at the wheel. We're going to cover what happened in Washington, what a nominee's 69-page financial disclosure quietly reveals about where the Federal Reserve is heading, and why a signal from the CEO of the largest bank in America may be the most underreported moment of this entire cycle. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand why the convergence happening right now is not a coincidence. Let's start with the piece that almost nobody in mainstream finance is taking seriously, and that is the Federal Reserve angle. Kevin Warsh has just been nominated as the next Fed chair, and his Senate confirmation hearing is set. Now, the headlines are covering the usual stuff: monetary policy, interest rates, economic outlook, but here's what they're not telling you. According to Warsh's 69-page financial disclosure, this man holds over $100 million in assets, and buried inside that document is something extraordinary. He has early-stage investments in roughly a dozen crypto and blockchain companies, all structured through venture fund vehicles. That makes Kevin Warsh not only one of the wealthiest Fed chair nominees in American history, but almost certainly the one with the deepest personal ties to the digital asset ecosystem. Let that sink in for a moment. The person who may soon control the most powerful monetary lever on the planet has already placed personal capital into the infrastructure of decentralized finance. His holdings include DeFi lending platforms, decentralized exchanges built on Solana and Ethereum, and Layer 2 scaling networks. Now, none of those are XRP directly, but here is the macro signal you need to extract from this. When the incoming Fed chair is personally invested in the digital asset space, the regulatory and monetary environment around that space fundamentally changes. The institutional ceiling does not just get raised, it gets removed. And XRP, as the asset specifically engineered for institutional cross-border settlement, sits in a uniquely powerful position when that ceiling disappears. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because that Fed development doesn't exist in a vacuum. It connects directly to something happening right now on Capitol Hill that the XRP community has been watching for months. Garlinghouse spent a day in Washington, D.C. sitting down with some of the most consequential figures in United States financial policy. We're talking about Senator Hagerty, Senator Bernie Moreno, Senator Tim Scott, Senator John Boozman, and Patrick Witt, the key crypto policy advisor inside the White House itself. Garlinghouse also appeared on the stage at the Semaphore World Economic Summit. After those meetings, he said publicly, and I want you to hear this clearly, that he knows they are closer than ever to getting this done. Now think about what that represents strategically. You do not see the leadership of Solana in those rooms. You do not see the head of any other blockchain project sitting at that table with the most powerful members of the Senate Banking Committee and the White House's own crypto architect. Garlinghouse is there because Ripple has spent years building the institutional credibility and the regulatory relationships that put them at the center of this conversation. That is not luck. That is the result of a long-term strategy playing out exactly as designed, and we are watching it in real time. So where does the Clarity Act actually stand right now? Let me give you the honest picture, because there's been a lot of noise and a lot of fear on social media, and I want to cut through it with facts. Senate Banking Committee members and their staff are currently in the final stages of drafting the bill. The stablecoin yield debate, which was the issue that blew up the January markup, appears to be on the verge of resolution. Senator Tom Tillis is preparing to release draft language outlining the compromise reached between banks and crypto firms on that specific question. Areas like DeFi provisions have reportedly come close to resolution as well. What remains open includes ethics language and a handful of tokenization-related issues. Now, social media went into a panic when Senate Banking Committee Chair Tim Scott released his upcoming schedule without mentioning a Clarity Act markup date. But Paradigm's VP of Regulatory Affairs, Justin Slaughter, pushed back hard on that fear, pointing out that the actual deadline pressure does not begin until after Memorial Day. That gives senators a window of roughly 6 to 7 weeks to move the bill out of committee and onto the Senate floor. Within the full legislative calendar, there are approximately 12 to 13 weeks remaining to get this across the line. Senator Tim Scott went on Fox News and addressed the stablecoin yield question directly, and what he said matters. He pointed to a White House report showing that savings deposits have not leaked into stablecoins. In fact, savings account deposits actually increased since the third quarter of last year. Scott called the fear around this a case of false evidence appearing real, and he framed the Clarity Act as essential to keeping America the dominant economic force on the planet. He said he expects the rewards issue resolved within 2 weeks, the DeFi provisions closed behind, and is targeting completion heading into summer. The honest reality is that the timeline has shifted, and not every Republican is fully aligned yet, which is a challenge when you still need Democratic crossover votes to reach the threshold. That is the honest picture. Not doomed, but not a done deal either. But let me show you something most people are completely missing when they look at the Clarity Act debate, because the legislative mechanics are only half the story. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Chase, the largest bank in the United States, recently made positive public comments about digital assets and crypto. Now, if you understand the history here, you know why that sentence is significant. This is the same man who spent years calling Bitcoin a fraud. For him to shift publicly and make favorable remarks about the space is not a casual opinion change. Analysts watching this closely are reading it as a signal that some form of negotiation has been completed behind the scenes, that the banks and the crypto industry have found enough common ground on the stablecoin yield compromise and the broader Clarity Act framework that major financial institutions feel comfortable stepping out of the shadows. When JP Morgan's CEO changes his public posture on an asset class, institutions downstream start updating their compliance frameworks. That matters for XRP more than for any other digital asset, because XRP was specifically built to interface with the correspondent banking system. The banks coming off the sidelines is not a generic crypto story, it is an XRP story. And the White House is not a passive observer in this process. Patrick Witt, who has been one of the most reliable sources of clarity on legislative progress, confirmed that the senators have conducted multiple rounds of stakeholder input, including from both the crypto side and the banking side. He confirmed that a compromise on the stablecoin yield issue, which was the central reason the January markup collapsed, has been reached and is expected to hold. He said the senators are doing their final input solicitation before releasing the full revised text, likely in conjunction with the rest of the bill. Franklin Templeton's head of digital asset innovation added a layer to this picture, noting that once the Clarity Act passes, traditional investment products can begin flowing through wallet-based distribution channels, which opens an entirely new wealth-building pathway for retail and institutional investors simultaneously. Now let's talk about what the Clarity Act actually does for XRP specifically, because this is the part of the conversation that deserves the most time and the most precision. If the Clarity Act passes in its current form, it would codify XRP's status as a digital commodity in federal statute. This builds on two prior developments, the 2025 court outcome and the March 2026 joint release from the SEC and the CFTC that already treated XRP as a commodity in practice. But a federal statute is categorically different from a court ruling or a regulatory guidance. It means that future SEC chairs cannot simply decide to relitigate XRP as a security. Reversing that classification would require a new act of Congress. That is a structural protection that no court ruling and no regulatory statement can provide. That is permanent institutional clarity. What does that unlock in practice? Banks that have been sitting on the sidelines, not because they doubted the technology, but because their legal and compliance teams could not sign off on integrating an asset with unresolved regulatory status. Those banks can now move. Once XRP's commodity status is locked in, U.S. banks can integrate XRP into their full payment rails and cross-border transaction infrastructure using Ripple's platform. Garlinghouse himself has said that Ripple's existing business doesn't change dramatically, but the act opens the door for U.S. banks and global banks with significant U.S. operations to participate without the legal exposure they currently face. Ripple has been spending the past several years building the infrastructure in anticipation of exactly this moment. Reports indicate they have deployed roughly $3 billion since 2023 on acquisitions, custody solutions, prime brokerage services, and treasury enterprise infrastructure. They have been positioning for a U.S. regulatory unlock that is now closer than it has ever been. Beyond the banking integration story, the Clarity Act creates the conditions for institutional capital flows at a scale the space has not yet seen. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, large asset managers. These are entities that cannot touch an asset that exists in a legal gray zone. Their mandates and compliance frameworks require defined classification. With XRP formally categorized as a commodity under federal law, U.S. exchanges and custodians can expand their offerings to include derivatives and structured products. And critically, the legal ambiguity that has blocked a spot XRP ETF disappears. That is the door through which BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, and similar institutions could walk with their own XRP-based products. Some analysts are describing the combination of legislative clarity and Ripple's institutional infrastructure build-out as a dual-force effect. Regulatory certainty plus a fully constructed institutional stack covering custody, prime brokerage, and treasury services creates a complete on-ramp for capital that has been waiting on the sidelines. Here's the frame I want to leave you with, because this is the insight that separates the people in this community from everyone else watching from the outside. The mainstream is covering the Clarity Act as a crypto regulation story. It is not. It is a story about which country controls the infrastructure layer of the digitized global financial system and which digital settlement asset sits at the center of that infrastructure. Brad Garlinghouse is in Washington not to lobby for a speculative asset. He is there because Ripple built the technology that institutions need and governments are beginning to recognize it. The Fed nominee is personally invested in digital asset infrastructure. The largest bank CEO is shifting his public stance. The White House crypto advisor is confirming progress. The Senate Banking Committee chair is giving timelines. Every one of these data points is pointing in the same direction. The patient holders who understood the long game from the beginning are watching the confirmation of everything they believe come together in real time. This is not hype. This is institutional inevitability. The Clarity Act may not be signed tomorrow. The timeline may shift another few weeks. But the direction is set, the stakeholders are aligned, and Ripple has a seat at the table that no other blockchain project can claim. Your job right now is to stay informed, stay patient, and understand the macro picture well enough to hold conviction when the noise gets loud. That is what separates the smart money from the crowd. Mike out.